It is a Friday morning on KCMO, and for the first time in a couple of weeks since I had a couple of Fridays off for this summer, we're back with a featured Friday, and who better after a group of elections on Tuesday than our friend Nick Haines, KC PBS, the show Week in Review, airing tonight at 7:30. Kind enough to have me on there. So, Nick, here you are. Good morning.
Well, thank you, Pete. You know, I have to say, the news developments have been so great. I've been on my phone so much. My hand and my arm were absolutely in agony trying to keep up with all of the latest paces of change. And it's not just at the national level, of course, everything that happens locally.
You got to ice that elbow, my man. That's the key. That's the key. Well, let's start with Tuesday night. The results, the Missouri had all the statewide races, all the attention. Mike Kehoe, of course, winning the gubernatorial primary. What to you, as you sit there and look at those races in particular, stood out to you as a big surprise to you in Missouri?
Well, on the Missouri side was certainly the Jay Ashcroft coming in third.
Yeah.
I happened to, and I was on the show, I think it was in about February. You asked me about that race, who was going to win, which I never like to say, but you twisted my arm.
I know, I did.
And I said Jay Ashcroft because he has huge name recognition. And we had just come from a huge event with him where he was cheery, fun, humorous. He was a treat on and off camera. And the idea that with all of that name recognition, when, you know, the presidential race is sucking the oxygen out of the room and people don't necessarily know everybody was running, it was remarkable that he came in third. That, to me, was the biggest surprise of the entire night on both sides of state line.
You know, he didn't have as much money, but gosh, that Ashcroft name, I was told, is worth $6 to $7 million, and he couldn't capitalize on it. Why?
Yeah, I don't know exactly the reason why. One reason, certainly, though, is that what did the Trump endorsement do? With the fact that all of them were endorsed, certainly didn't help him. As you did have, he could have viewed himself as a conservative candidate with Bill Eigel, Mike Kehoe lesser so, but you know, that gave the excuse for people who are conservative to say, well, if he's good enough for Donald Trump, I'm going to vote for Mike Kehoe. I suppose it's also about the constituencies you get out to come and vote. If you're in a rural area, you're a farmer, Mike Kehoe had that Missouri Farm Bureau vote tied up. If you were concerned in your own neighborhood about public safety, for instance, and what was happening with law and order, Mike Kehoe at the Fraternal Order of Police. And by the way, I saw just before Election Day, you know, the former Chief Rick Smith showing up at a campaign rally for, not for Jay Ashcroft or Bill Eigel, but for Mike Kehoe. So he had that locked up as well. And then if you're a moderate voter, certainly Mike Kehoe was going to have much more wiggle room on the abortion issue. And if you're in Kansas City and a moderate voter, you would say, boy, you know, I'm interested in what's happening with the stadiums. Mike Kehoe was the only candidate who you could go to and say he would at least look at that to give money for the sports stadiums in Kansas City.
All great points. So now here locally, Jackson County prosecutor's race, I think, is the most interesting local race we'll have coming up in the fall. And Melissa Johnson, Quentin Lucas's director of public safety, doesn't just win the primary. She wins it running away over John Gromowski, who had all the big signs up and down Ward Parkway, and Stephanie Burton, who was a local attorney. So is that credit to Quentin Lucas? Can he go running around saying, look at me, or what is that a testament to, Nick?
Well, he could certainly say, look at me, as he will with a lot of issues. And you're right about that if yard signs and billboards were our indicator of who should win an election, John should have won that hands down. I was in a race, by the way, back in early April, when there were no yard signs, but and that was at on the Ward Parkway, Rock the Parkway event, and his signs were everywhere, even back then, before anybody put signs out. It is a remarkable, and by the way, what makes this the biggest win for me of the entire night was whoever wins that primary, which in this case, of course, was Melissa Johnson, is the person who's really going to be the next prosecutor. When is the last time there was a Republican prosecutor in Jackson County? So yes, she has an opponent with Tracy Chappell, who's a very effective criminal defense attorney. But that, to me, most of these other races we talk about, there's still a shot, even if it's a small one, for Democrats to win. This is going to be I think, you know, this is the face of the next prosecutor. But she did do a great campaign. She had been in the prosecutor's office before. She was the first appointed public safety person in the city hall in Kansas City, Missouri. That gave her a lot of constituencies she could rely on. But what made it more interesting was the fact that there were two African Americans in that race. We were told that John Gromowski then would benefit from that. He would win because the black vote would be split. It never happened, even though Stephanie Burton, by the way, I had her on a show, was a very effective communicator and did an exceptional job, I thought.
Well, what it shows me is that people, don't they vote based on race like maybe pollsters think or people think. I don't know, because Melissa Johnson got, 45%? I think Stephanie Burton was around 25%. So that's 70% right there.
Yeah. And the other thing in this was the fact that you have to pick a ballot. And in Missouri, most of the competitive races were happening on the Republican side. So if you're picking a Republican ballot, that meant you couldn't be picking a Democrat one, too. So if you were voting for Missouri governor, the Mike Keoghs of the world and the Jay Ashcrofts, you couldn't be voting in that prosecutor race.
That's a good point.
And many of those voters would have more likely picked John Gromowski than one of the other two candidates in that race.
Now, and you don't think, with all the issues for this Jackson County Prosecutor's Office, from record-setting homicides in Kansas City to Super Bowl parade shootings, you don't think that the Jackson County voter might look at a Republican this time around?
Well, I thought last time around you had Jean Peters Baker running against Tracy Chappell. There was very much concern that there was a lot of anxiety about Jean Peters Baker at the time, what her positions were relating to the police, some of the actions she had taken as prosecutor, and yet she still won comfortably during the last election. So that is my view on that. I think we now have Melissa Johnson has the wind at her back on this, has most of the groups allied in Jackson County. With her, I think it would be a very steep curve for Tracy Chappell to win that, even though she is an effective person. And I certainly enjoyed her when we met with her 4 years ago when we did a debate in that race.
Nick Haines, Kansas City PBS, the show airing tonight, Week in Review, right there on Kansas City PBS, 7:30, and then, of course, Sunday mornings at 11 o'clock. The Kansas side, two things stand out to me. We can talk about the 3rd District a little bit, but big thing has got to be the sheriff's race. Calvin Hayden, incumbent 2-time, gets ousted fairly convincingly by his former undersheriff and first-time politician, Doug Bedford. What do you make of it?
Well, that says something about the major shifts that have also happened demographically in Johnson County. I can't believe that Calvin Hayden didn't believe that when he decided to launch an investigation into election fraud from the 2020 election, that he didn't feel that was going to be somehow have a resonance with Republican voters in a primary. Again, few people show up in a primary. They tend to be the partisans, that he was going to benefit somehow from that. Clearly, that did not happen. But again, Johnson County has dramatically shifted. And I would put him, I asked you on the show, who is the biggest winner, who is the biggest loser? He's the biggest loser of the night. And why I say that is, he's basically out of a job.
Yeah.
He has been in law enforcement for his entire life here. That's the end of the road for him. In many of these other races, whether it be somebody like Jay Ashcroft, yes, it's disappointing, but he's got other things he can do with his life. This is going to be sort of the end of the road for Calvin Hayden. In that sense, he was the biggest loser on both sides of state line.
And now I think that race becomes much more interesting because, let's be honest, the Democrat in that race, Byron Roberson, the Prairie Village police chief, probably wanted Hayden so he could use that stuff against him. If I'm just, guessing here who he would have rather faced in this race coming up in November.
Well, I didn't go into this specifically because it wasn't he didn't have a competitive primary, but the Prairie Village police chief in the editorial that was in the Kansas City Star said there was several questions to be asked about him and what he has actually done as the Prairie Village police chief. When you have even the Star editorial board questioning some of the decisions he's made as police chief in Prairie Village, that even more gives you the feeling that Doug Bedford is a shoo-in this November, the former undersheriff there in Johnson County, to be the next sheriff.
Well, that means then that you would have potentially Johnson County voters splitting their vote and voting for Sharice Davids, but then voting for Doug Bedford, the Republican, for sheriff. You think that's going to happen?
Well, that does happen. It does happen all the time. People do split, and absolutely. But again, you talk about Sharice Davids. She won 10 points last time.
Over Amanda, yeah. Was it 12 or 10?
10 points.
10?
Remember,
okay.
Donald Trump won Kansas by 15 points, 10 points to... And she keeps increasing her lead there in that race. It's hard to see what Prasanth Reddy, who won that race, he is a cancer doctor, amazing. He's an immigrant. That should be good for people there. He's got a military background. That should all be huge successes, and yet there's no evidence that Sharice Davids is going to be knocked off her perch there in the 3rd District come this November. She's not on any of those credible lists to say which seats are going to flip this November. You don't see her on any of those major lists.
What does he have to do if you're ready?
Yeah, I had a breakfast at First Watch, not far from here, with a top political former candidate who is advising Prasad Reddy, who was a little infuriated by some of the things he was doing in that race. But he said, you have to be doing something incredibly dramatic, or that Sharice Davids does an own goal of some kind, or rely on some sort of own goal. That could even be an illness or something. That it would be very, very tough for him to break through in that race. And again, we're looking at an election now where Democrats seem to be in having far more motivation, far more energized than they were just a few weeks ago. That's going to that's going to give a much more greater benefit to Sharice Davids than the Republican candidate in that race.
So this person was saying to you that he's got to get a little more. He was upset with what he was doing, or with what he wasn't doing.
What he wasn't doing, not doing enough to you can't concentrate it on. You can't do the social culture issues in that race. You've got to really fixate on the kitchen table issues. That's where you're going to separate, jobs, healthcare, what's happening in your schools. But in some respects, though, when you think about the issue of immigration, you could make the connection, of course, to say that is a jobs issue. But you've got to speak it in that language.
Yes.
That's the language you have to use to make a dent in that race.
Yeah, there's got to be a little more juice there, I would say. Yeah. That's what's needed.
I have to say, I live in Johnson County, in an area actually in southern Johnson County where you barely ever saw any Democratic signs. But you have to understand how that community is shifting. And I counted up the houses closest to me, the 12 houses closest to me. There are 5 new families of those 12 houses since the last presidential election. Okay, many of those people coming from other states, many of them coming from the Missouri side in Kansas City to vote. I don't know what their politics are, but that you can see there's a change taking place on who is actually living in Johnston County today. And I'll say that 4 of the 12 families, there is at least one person of color living in one of those homes. Johnston County is changing, even in more conservative areas of the county. That will also only benefit Sharice Davids.
All right, Nick Haines on KCMO. Let's take a break, come back with Nick as we roll through the 9 o'clock hour on 95.7 FM KCMO. Nick Haines, Kansas City PBS, joining us in studio for our Feature Friday segment, putting a bow on the elections from Tuesday. Week in Review airing tonight at 7:30, Sunday at 11 a.m. Kind enough to have me on this week. Nick, we were just talking about it during the break. This is your 30th year covering elections around Kansas City. I know you're like 42 years old,
Absolutely.
So you've been doing this since you were 12, but wow.
It's only when you said it's been 30 years, because I said it was 1994. It didn't seem like, but yeah, it was Bill Graves who was running against Jim Slattery for the governor's race in Kansas. That was back in 1994. We went out to Western Kansas, did one of the first televised debates in that race, and I've been doing them ever since. In fact, I became a citizen in 2000, by the way, because I was doing so many of these debates. I thought I didn't want somebody telling me, hey, he's not a citizen. Why is he doing these things? And so that was important to me. I made that happen. And, so that would take away one of those views. But yeah, I've been doing it a very long time. It's been interesting because one of the trends to me of this particular campaign is the demise of debates in some ways. It's already been happening, but Mike Keogh won that governor's race this week in the Republican nomination without ever doing one debate. Refusing every single invitation. That is kind of remarkable for such a major race. They may do one, perhaps, and call it a day, but to not do any was kind of remarkable this time. And even in some of these other races, I see Josh Hawley and his main rival in the U.S. Senate race, Lucas Kunce, also now still not confirmed on any debates at this moment in time, and is still up in the air, even on the presidential election.
Yes.
If any of these debates will actually take place. But we also had some strange moments, which I shared on the show this week, didn't I?
Well, take me through. What when you look back on these 30 years, I just said to you, I said, what is that time, that race, that thing that you think about when it comes to covering elections here in the Kansas City area? What's the number one story?
Well, to me, the one that really sticks out was in the year 2000, which is when Jay Ashcroft's father, John Ashcroft, was running in the U.S. Senate race in Missouri against Mel Carnahan, who was the governor of Missouri, and we did the only televised debate. We did it from the 18th and Vine Jazz District there at the Gem Theatre, and that was a very contentious race. Mel Carnahan departs that venue and dies in a plane crash. I
didn't realize it was your debate.
Yes, and that was, we talk about 9/11 and how people felt about that. I didn't have a huge connection to New York, so that's a huge tragedy, but didn't hit me in the same visceral, personal way as that one, because we had been so intimately involved. It's not just the debate. You spend months going through the negotiations with all of these campaigns, all of the top people with John Ashcroft and Mel Carnahan. And, you know, one of his campaign aides died. His son, Randy, was a big part of the campaign we'd also been negotiating with, died in the plane crash as well. So that really was emotionally gut-wrenching. And what was interesting about that race, too, then, with his death, all of the legal battle, because his wife... Jean Carnahan said she was going to be the candidate. Well, it's like, how can you, the ballots were already there. You couldn't take the husband's name off the ballot, Mel Carnahan's name. Could she become the senator? So there was a lot of legal battles. She ended up being seated, but lost pretty much soon afterwards. So that was, to me, the biggest, most dramatic debate experience that I've had. And it was also one of those where people get so fixated on the sort of symbolic gestures, not the policy. It's always, and Mel Carnahan, I thought it was a great debate on issues. But Mel Carnahan, at the very beginning of the debate, takes his jacket off and talks to a voter. And it was like, oh, he's a man of the people. All these symbolic types of things that people resonate with. And there is a lot of that with TV. You have your sound bites that you already pre-planned but in advance, and these little gestures you might use to somehow cut through the coverage, because that's what people remember, not your policy necessarily on a specific issue.
My, how times have changed, huh?
Absolutely. But I remember Steve Watkins, who was... Jake LaTurner's predecessor in that second
there's a
district
name I
race.
haven't heard in a while.
I know. I did a debate there, and I got to meet him before, and he came in early. He wanted to know what was going on, and got to enjoy him, talking behind the scenes. And he says, Nick, I got a lot to say, but I'm not going to say any of it because I can only lose this debate, Nick. I can't win. And in that respect, that is what happens with debates. We only focus on the mistakes. And in that sense, that's what happened to Joe Biden. Nobody, can anybody really fixate on any of the policy things that were stated? It was really just his voice and that he couldn't finish sentences versus any policy differences.
Yeah,
and that's what we focus on.
And that's exactly what we focus on. You're right. Nick Haines is here on KCMO. In the next couple of minutes, Nick, I don't want to overshadow what is happening in Jackson County. And this week, the Missouri State Tax Commission says, hey, Frank White, Jackson County, roll back to the 15% threshold for tax assessments. And Frank White's saying no. So how does this fix itself?
Wow. Let me say, if there hadn't been an election week, we did talk about it. And I think we did a great job on this. But boy, that would have been the number one story because of the scope and scale of this. We're talking about, 75% of the homes, of the properties. And again, I said, I was going to take my shoes and socks off, and that was going to be about 225,000 homes or more. Is absolutely remarkable. If they were to be rolled back, that would be a financial disaster, not just for Jackson County, but all of the jurisdictions that rely on that property tax revenue, schools, libraries, all of those other areas too. And yes, as you mentioned, the Jackson County Executive Frank White says he's going to appeal. This is, a political move against me, and it always seems to be, it's always somebody who was out to get him. It's never that he's done anything wrong. And I know on Monday, the Jackson County Legislature is going to try to call a vote to block any appeal from Jackson County Executive, so he can't appeal. Whether they have the votes or not, enough, because that would require 6 votes to overcome a veto from the executive, we will see, but that will happen on Monday.
Okay, look at you. I didn't know that. So that's some new information coming in from Nick Haines on KCMO. Watch tonight on Kansas City PBS at 7:30, Sunday mornings at 11. And I got 30 seconds, but next week you got a big show coming up too.
Yeah, this actually today is the 10th anniversary of Ferguson, the shooting of Michael Brown, the police shooting of Michael Brown, and weeks of protests and looting and arson that all took place. We're doing the state of policing. We have Police Chief Stacey Graves, the Jackson County Prosecutor, Jackson County Sheriff Darrell Forte, and Gwen Grant of the Urban League. And it's really about the state of policing. We claimed all these things were going to change. What happened? What are we doing differently today? And that's what we'll be focusing on. It's an hour-long special next week.
You're the man, Nick Haines. Thank you for being here, brother. News coming up in 2 minutes. We're back on KCMO.